Well, this week we begin Exodus chapter 5, and I'm going to change up a bit on you today. Usually I read to you from the complete Jewish Bible. This time I'm going to read from a version called simply the Scriptures. And it is for one reason only. Everywhere that the original Hebrew text includes the name of God, Yud-He-Vav-He. I say Yehovah, some say Yahweh. That's what this translation adds back in. The point of my doing this will, I think, become self-evident to you. So I just want you to follow along with me in whatever version you have. So open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 5. We're going to read it all, but again, what I'm about to read to you is in the original. I'm not modifying it. This is the way our Bibles ought to read, but they don't. And afterwards, Moshe and Aharon went in and said to Pharaoh, "Thus said Yehovah, Elohim of Israel, let my people go so that they keep a festival to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is Yehovah, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know who Yehovah is, nor am I going to let Israel go." And they said, "The Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and slaughter to Yehovah, our Elohim." Elohim means God. "Lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the sovereign of Mitzrayim, that's Egypt, said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your burdens." And Pharaoh said, "See, the people of the land are many now, and you make them cease from their burdens." And the same day Pharaoh commanded the slave drivers of the people and their foremen, saying, "You will no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and lay on them the required amount of bricks which they made before. Do not diminish it, for they are idle. That's why they cry out, saying, 'Let us go and slaughter to our Elohim.' Let more work be laid upon the men, so that they labor in it and not pay attention to words of falsehood." And the slave drivers of the people and their foremen went out and spoke to the people, saying, "Thus said Pharaoh, I do not give you straw. Go, take straw for yourselves wherever you find it, for your work shall not be diminished." And the people were scattered in all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. And the slave drivers were hurrying them on, saying, "Complete your work. Your daily amount is when there was straw." Also the foremen of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's slave drivers had set over them, were beaten, and they were asked, "Why have you not completed your task in making bricks both yesterday and today as before?" And the foreman of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, "Why do you treat your servants this way? There is no straw given to your servants." And they say to us, "Make bricks. And see, your servants are beaten, but your own people are at fault." But he said, "You're idle, you're idle. That is why you say, 'Let us go and slaughter to Yehovah.' So now go and work. Straw is not given to you, but deliver the amount of bricks." And the foreman of the children of Israel saw that they were in trouble after it was said, "You are not to diminish your daily amount of bricks." And when they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood there to meet them. And they said to them, "Let Yehovah look on you and judge, because you have made us loathsome in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, to give a sword in their hand to kill us." And Moses returned to Yehovah and said, "Yehovah, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you send me? For ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to your people. You've not delivered your people at all." Does it surprise you a little bit that God's name appears so many times in this chapter? It ought to. Bible translations over the years have tended to obliterate the use of God's name by replacing it with more generic terms, like just Lord or God. but by reinserting God's formal personal name as found in the original Hebrew, we get a clearer picture of just what was transpiring here between Moses and Pharaoh. And as I've discussed with you on several occasions, every ancient culture believed in multiple gods and a spirit world. Every ancient culture had a fairly similar set of gods. It's just that their names varied, and the territory where each god ruled had to be defined. But knowing each god's name was all important to the ancient mindset, because knowing a god's name, that was the key to communicating with that God and persuading that God to do what you wanted him to do. So here we see Pharaoh not wondering as if there was such a thing as God, or if there was a God of the Hebrews, but it was only that he obviously had never heard specifically of this God named Yehovah or Yahweh. Further, since gods were territorial, and the Hebrews lived in Egypt, Pharaoh was incredulous that there could have existed a God that had some undefined kind of influence within Egypt, and he didn't know about him. I mean, where did this God, Yehovah, fit within the hierarchy of gods? Why had no one introduced Pharaoh to him before now? What was this new God's sphere of influence? Perhaps most important to Pharaoh, why would he need to be at all concerned with this Yehovah when he already commanded the most powerful gods of Egypt? In fact, the Pharaoh himself was considered to be the incarnation of a god, and therefore divine. For Pharaoh, Yehovah was an unwanted rival. So Pharaoh was skeptical. He was downright offended. Indeed, Pharaoh had never heard of Yehovah. And after all, it was only recently that the Lord had even revealed his name to mankind for the first time. He revealed it to Moses on Mount Sinai in Midian just a few weeks earlier. So Moses and Aaron go into Pharaoh. They tell him what God demands of the king of Egypt. And it was that Israel should be allowed to go free into the desert for a time of a 3 days journey, away from their captors, to worship Yehovah, or as it really should be taken in, to say in verse 1, to make a pilgrimage festival to me. What Moses says is that the Lord wants Israel to make a chag, which is Hebrew for pilgrimage festival. Pilgrimage festivals simply mean the worshipers are required to take a journey, if necessary. And they go to a specified place, usually to where there was a sanctuary or a shrine, to celebrate, to pay homage to this God. And when we get to later chapters of Exodus and then Leviticus, and we're going to find that that of the 7 biblical festivals that God ordains for Israel, 3 of them are chag, pilgrimages. And in each case, they involve traveling to the temple, which, by the way, wasn't always in Jerusalem. The laughable idea that Pharaoh would allow the Israelites a few days to go worship their God in the wilderness merely amused Pharaoh. What really chafed him was the words that Moses and Aaron spoke, established clearly to Pharaoh that Yehovah considered the Israelites as belonging to him. And of course, this is the crux of the matter. Because as Pharaoh insists, au contraire, these Hebrews don't belong to the God of Hebrews, to the God of the Hebrews, they belong to me. For just a moment, let's detour. I want to zoom in on a small phrase in verse 1, as it sets up an important principle that helps us to understand key areas of the Bible in general. I want to call your attention to the use of 2 little words, my people, which is what God often calls the Hebrews. Interestingly, several hundred years into the future, God would call some of the Hebrews not my people. Now, what's important to understand is that in the Hebrew scriptures, going back to a time just after Isaac was born, perhaps 600 years earlier from the time we're at in Exodus, God began referring to the Hebrews as his Ami, Hebrew for my people. Now, the word or Ami, people, is not to be taken into the sense of random individuals, nor is it used to refer to an anonymous group of individuals like some crowd somewhere. For instance, from where you are sitting, just if you kind of turn around and look at all the people around you, Ami is not people in that sense. It's not simply some number of generic human beings gathered together. Rather, people, Ami, is somewhat synonymous with the word nation. So Ami is a group of humans with a common heritage. Whether that heritage is natural or adopted, that is, Israel is a separately identifiable people, a nation. Yet Ami is not precisely synonymous with nation. The word used for nation in the Bible is goyim, but you'll never see the word goyim refer to Hebrew people or to the Hebrew nation specifically, because as of about the same time as Isaac, about 1900 BC, the word goyim came to specifically indicate Gentile nations. That is, everybody except the Hebrews. So after about Genesis chapter 12, when God is referring to the nation of Israel, it is the word amim that is generally employed, while all other nations of the world are referred to in Hebrew as goyim. So the Hebrew original amim is Israel, goyim is everybody else. Now I point this out because it makes both biblical history and prophecy a lot easier to untangle if you know when the terms people and nation are referring to Gentile nations and people or to Hebrew people and the Hebrew nation. Big difference. Now, we first discovered the importance of understanding the word goyim back in Genesis because it enabled us to unlock the significance of Jacob's blessing upon Joseph's son Ephraim. That Ephraim would in some undefined way become a fullness or a blessing of the goyim, the Gentile nations, as opposed to the Hebrew nation. Now, if you attended my 10 Lost Tribes seminar, then you know that Ephraim and the fullness of Gentiles, that phrase, are central to understanding end times prophecy. That's why I encourage you to always have a good concordance handy when you're studying the Torah. Just as God's name has become totally obscured in the Bible, so there is unnecessary confusion over the use of the word nation in the Bible as to whether it's speaking about Gentiles, Hebrews, or everybody in general. Now, it's kind of interesting how the Pharaoh responds to Moses' and Aaron's message from God. Pharaoh doesn't deny that there is a God called Jehovah, nor that this Jehovah fellow is Israel's God. He simply doesn't see what it has to do with him. I mean, we're in Egypt, right? Therefore, by all understanding of the people of that day about how gods are supposed to operate, Egypt is the private realm of the Egyptian gods. And Pharaoh thinks the Egyptian gods are powerful and many. Why would I worry about one measly Hebrew god? And on top of that, a god who's a god over a bunch of slaves. Some people If this Jehovah is so powerful, how come his people are slaves to me, to Egypt? That's the thinking. This was undeniable evidence to Pharaoh that the Egyptian gods were more powerful than the one Hebrew God, and that he had no reason to pay any attention to Yahweh. Now I wonder about what it was that Aaron told Pharaoh, because what we read here in chapter 5 isn't entirely what we've been told that God instructed Moses to say to Pharaoh. I mean, notice that it seems to have been embellished just a tad. As in the last part of verse 3, where the words are, otherwise he, meaning God, might strike us with a plague or a sword. Where'd that come from? Did God tell Moses that if Pharaoh didn't let him go in the desert to worship him, that God would strike down the Israelites? Not aware of, not that we're aware of that he did any such thing. Notice what ordinary men we are dealing with here with Moses and Aaron. So far, they're not doing very good. Just about like you or I probably would in a circumstance like this, standing before such a great and imposing man as the king of Egypt. So what do we decide to do? We're going to jazz it up a little bit. I mean, God has such an economy of words that are so to the point, maybe we can assist him just a little bit. A few extra adjectives, a few extra adverbs, a little more drama. So Pharaoh responds. He tells Moses and Aaron, go back to work. And that he has no intentions of letting that enormous group of Israelites, who are the laborers of Egypt, the craftsmen who do the bulk of the building, go on a 3-day holiday. Then Pharaoh sets a precedent that's going to be repeated ad nauseum in the centuries ahead. He takes the irrational tact of making the Israelites work that's so vital to Egypt's well-being, and he makes it almost impossible to achieve. He tells them that they have to gather their own straw for making the millions upon millions of mud bricks necessary for building more cities. Now, this is disruptive in every way, and would have had the result of fewer bricks, not more. And this is attested to in verse 12, where it says the people had to stop their brick making and scatter throughout the land of Egypt to fetch straw that added the necessary strength to the mud bricks. And this is a good time to point out that the Israelites, by the way, did not build the pyramids of Egypt. The pyramid building era was long over. By now, pharaohs and nobles were being buried in hollowed out and magnificently decorated shafts and caves. The primary construction projects of the Israelites were roads and military forts and storage facilities. And the primary building material was mud brick, not stone. In verse 14, the predictable end result is shown when the Egyptian taskmasters asked the officers of Israel, why haven't you fulfilled your quota of bricks yesterday and today as you did formerly? And the officers of Israel, the foremen, so to speak, were beaten for this lowered output. Now, these officers were not the elders. They were what are sometimes called scribes. This is the second of the new types of elected or appointed leaders of Israel who represent the people. Now, of course, the real goal of Pharaoh, the real goal, was to harass and punish. It was hatred gone wild. In World War II Germany, about the only thing that the pre-war economy had going for it was the Jews, who were the industrialists, bankers, and scientists of Germany. After the start of World War II, as the Nazis suddenly turned a demonic rage inward and started exterminating Jews by the millions, all it accomplished was to damage their economy, destroy their best source of technology, and eventually it limited their ability to make war. Just as Satan used Hitler as a puppet, so it was with Pharaoh. He had just taken the first steps towards Egypt's devastation, the thing that would be necessary for the release of Jehovah's firstborn, Israel. Now it's interesting to note that in one of the great store cities that the Israelites are given credit for building, Pithom, an archaeological find has confirmed this story of the bricks in the straw. In 1883, and then later again in 1908, two Egyptologists made a startling discovery. They unearthed some mud brick structures in Pithom, in which the bottom courses of bricks were made with the normal content of cut straw. The middle courses were made with straw that had been pulled up by the roots, not cut. The final courses contained little to no straw whatsoever. Just another of the many proofs of the Exodus account. Now the scribes, the Hebrew foremen, beaten and now pretty irate, they turn on Moses and Aaron. In fact, they go around Moses and God, and they go directly to Pharaoh. Now he, of course, has no interest in their problems. How quickly faith can disappear, huh? I mean, just a few days earlier, they were fully persuaded and prepared to follow Moses as God's deliverer of his people. Today, with Pharaoh's decree that they have to go gather their own straw, and with the physical punishment inflicted upon the foreman for failure to make their quota of bricks, they call on this same God now to judge Moses, to punish him. We were told earlier that Moses told them in advance all that God told him on the mountain of God, and included in it that would have been Pharaoh would indeed reject the demands. No doubt they hadn't counted on the consequences. Following God always has consequences. It's not a free ride. Moses does exactly the right thing, though. He goes to God with this complaint of the people. Moses completely understands the Hebrews' upset at this turn of events. He feels terribly responsible. Now, let's be sure we get the correct tone of Moses' inquiry of God in verse 23. He was humble. He was concerned for the people. Had he done something he wasn't supposed to do? I mean, was there something he didn't do he should have done? I mean, how many times I have asked God this question when a direction I was so sure God had ordained for my life suddenly met with what seemed to me a pretty major bump in the road. Moses demanded nothing of God. He wasn't angry with God. Really, Moses was seeking reassurance. He was seeking confirmation that he was indeed obeying. Moses was learning. Well, let's continue our story now in Exodus chapter 6. We'll go back to our complete Jewish Bible for this chapter. Open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 6. Exodus chapter 6. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 65. Adonai said to Moshe, "Now you will see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. With a mighty hand he will send them off. With force he'll drive them from the land." God spoke to Moses, and he said to him, "I am Adonai. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov as El Shaddai, although I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah. Also with them I established my covenant to give them the land of Canaan, the land where they wandered about and lived as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians are keeping in slavery, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the people of Israel, I am Adonai. I will free you from the forced labor of the Egyptians, rescue you from their oppression, redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people. I will be your God. Then you will know that I am Adonai, your God, who freed you from the forced labor of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, but I will give it to you as your inheritance. I am Adonai. Now Moses said this to the people of Israel, but they wouldn't listen to him because they were so discouraged. Their slavery was so cruel. And Adonai said to Moses, go in and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel leave his land. Moses said to Adonai, look, the people of Israel haven't listened to me. How will Pharaoh listen to me, poor speaker that I am? But Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them orders concerning both the people of Israel and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. These were the heads of their families. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, were Hanok, Palu, Hetzron, and Carmi. These were the families of Reuben. The sons of Shimon, Simeon, were Yemuel, Yamin, Ohad, Yakin, Zochar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. These were the families of Shimon. These are the names of the sons of Levi with their descendants, Gershon, Kahat, and Merari. Levi lived to be 137 years old. The sons of Gershon were Libni and Shimi with their families. The sons of Kahat were Amram, Yitzhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. Kahat lived to be 133 years old. The sons of Merari were Machli and Mushi. These were the families of Levi with their descendants. Amram married Yehocheved, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. Amram lived to be 137 years old. The sons of Yitzhar were Korach, Nepheg, and Zihri. The sons of Uzziel were Mishael, Eltsaphan, and Sitri. Aaron married Elisheva, daughter of Aminadab and sister of Nachshon, and she bore him Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. The sons of Korach were Asir, Elkanah, and Aviasaph. These were the Korchi families. Eleazar, the son of Aaron, married one of the daughters of Putwel, and she bore him Pinchas. These were the heads of the families of Levi, family by family. These are the Aaron and Moses to whom Adonai said, bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt division by division, and who told Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel leave Egypt. These are the same, Moses and Aaron. Now on the day as Adonai spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, he said, I am Adonai. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I say to you. Moses answered Adonai, look, I'm such a poor speaker. Pharaoh won't listen to me. Now, I want to remind you that the first verse of chapter 6 is a direct continuation of the last verse of chapter 5. Now, as Moses prayed to Yehovah for an explanation, God immediately gives him the answer. Don't worry about it. I've got it all under control. Of course, that's not quite the words we read in the scripture, but it is the essence of God's words. God tells Moses that he's to familiarize the Hebrew people with his formal name, Yehovah, and that even though he was and is the God of the patriarchs, he did not make himself known to them. And one thing he didn't tell them was his personal name, which was Yehovah. Instead, verse 3 says that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and really all Hebrews up until now, knew God as El Shaddai. Typically, this is translated as God Almighty in our Bibles. Now, this was never a true translation. It's just a guess at what that term El Shaddai meant. So, to be most accurate, one would have to say that the first part of that name means the highest God. That's the meaning of that word El. And as I've shared with you, it has recently been discovered that the word Shaddai, which in the strictest sense is not a Hebrew word, it's a language cognate of the Akkadian word Shadu, means mountain. So the Lord is saying that Moses' ancestors knew him as the highest God of the mountain. Now I'm going to share something with you, something I am becoming more and more aware of and more unsure of as to why it's so. In verse 2, when God says to Moses, I am something, Most versions will say Lord, or they'll say Adonai, like we have in the Complete Jewish Bible. I am the Lord. And since Lord, follow me, is just the English translation of the Hebrew word Adonai, Lord and Adonai mean the same thing. But the original Hebrew is not either of these two words. It's Yud-He-Vav-He, Yehovah, God's personal name. And there's no Bible scholar I'm aware of that would even argue the point. The Hebrew letters Yud-He-Vav-He are there. And they're there in 6,000 other places in the Old Testament. 6,000. So the question is, why is it the majority of the time that the original Hebrew uses God's personal name, Yehovah, that our translations elect to use the term Lord or God? Why? Now, I can understand why Jews, even Messianic Jews, do this. It's because they've had a tradition for over 2,300 years against uttering or even writing the word God, let alone using his formal name. So why do Gentile Christians follow suit? This is such a pet peeve of mine. Somehow I think that when God gave us his personal name to use, when referring to him, he meant we ought to use it. Even if we're not precisely sure how to pronounce it. I mean, when the Bible uses his personal name, instead of something more generic like Lord, which admittedly does appear in the Bible from time to time, we need to know it. We need to read it that way, because in it, we see the personal and endearing nature of the Lord and not just some generic title. The reality is that most of the pagan gods, I don't know if you know this or not, were called Lord. That was standard, what you called a pagan god, Lord. Because Lord is just a rather ancient, if not outdated term that's synonymous with the word master. So it's just a sign of respect. It's not an actual name. Now we also need to know and use Yehovah's name, particularly in our era, because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has a challenger today. His name is Allah. Islam, and even many leaders within the church, want you to believe that Allah and Yehovah are two names for the same God. I mean, after all, Muslims will tell you, well, Allah means God. And most are aware that our Bibles invariably call the God of the Bible God. I got news for you. The Egyptians also referred to many of their gods as just God, particularly when one of their gods was the family god. We, Jews and Christians, have brought all this problem on ourselves. If we had just not replaced Yehovah with a generic word God, or Adonai, which is just Hebrew for Lord, so long ago, we'd have little trouble in recognizing that Allah, which is the formal name for the God of Islam, they can't possibly be the same God as Yehovah, which is the formal name for the God of the Bible, because they're two different names. One is not a translation of the other. God, like the word president, is the title of an office. It's not the name of the person who holds the office. Our current president is named Obama. His name is not president. God's name is Yehovah, not God. Certainly not Allah. Now we also need to understand what is actually being communicated to Moses at this point. God says that Moses' forefathers saw God as El Shaddai. Most versions say appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The original Hebrew word that's used here is ra'ah. and it means see or saw. More in the sense of perceiving, revealing. That is, we might say to somebody in a debate, oh, I finally see what you're talking about. I finally see it your way. That is, I finally comprehend, I perceive, I get it. It doesn't mean we see or saw like, wow, did you see that great looking car? It's not about our optic nerves operating correctly as it is to behold, to grasp the essence of something. So God is saying he revealed himself. He made his essence known to the patriarchs in a little different way than he's now revealing it to Moses. What's the difference? Well, one big difference is the level of intimacy. It's like the difference between addressing me as a less personal pastor or Mr. Bradford and the more personal Tom. Over time, God was making himself more known. He's making himself more personal, more accessible. Progressively, God is revealing himself to mankind, and this really is what we see happen throughout the Bible. While we get but an outline of God in Genesis, by the time we reach the end of the Torah, we have more information on God than we can even humanly digest. The next to the last revealed manifestation of God that we will read about in the Bible is Yeshua, Jesus. And Jesus made the relationship between God and man about as personal as it gets. He became one of us. He walked among us. He shared the woes of fleshly human existence with us. I say almost because when Jesus left, we then received the Holy Spirit. God no longer walked among us, external to us. He took the next step. Now he set up living within us. That's pretty profound. In the most literal possible sense, God dwells within us, internal to us. In verses 3 and 4, Moses would have understood that the point God was making was that he was giving more of himself to Moses than he did to Moses' ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what he was telling him. I'm giving more of myself to you than I ever gave to them. Jehovah was also going to give more of himself to Israel. And we see in verses 4 and 5, God once more established his universal reign over all. He reminds Moses that he was the Hebrews' God up in Canaan in verse 4, just as he was their God down in Egypt. And he has heard their cry for help. He also makes it quite clear that now, some 600 years after it was established, his covenant with Abraham, every last detail of it still stands. He gives Moses a message to take back to the people of Israel who were by now so discouraged at having their workload increased when what they thought was about to come about was relief from their oppression. And he gives them a message full of love and hope. His message to them is this: I, Jehovah, will bring you out of Egypt. I, Jehovah, will rescue you from your servitude to all that is Egypt. I, Jehovah, will redeem you. Further, I will take you as my people. I will be your God. I will bring you to the land of promise. I will give it to you, Israel, as your possession. I, Jehovah, I'm going to do it all. Israel, all you have to do is receive it as a blessing. What a deal. See, as much as the Egypt of the Exodus is real and tangible, it's also a pattern. It's a type. Egypt itself is going to be used throughout the rest of the Bible to represent servitude to a foreign master in a foreign place. a way of life that was not meant for God's people. But Egypt is also representative of the place where we all resided before we cried out to God to rescue us. When Christ came and made it possible for Gentiles to be joined to God's covenants with Israel, this list of promises we just read in verses 6 through 8, this list of I wills became applicable to all mankind who would trust in God's provision. God will bring everyone who trusts the Lord Yeshua out of servitude, out of the foreign place that we lived. He will redeem us. He will take us as his people. He will be our God. He will bring us to the eternal land of promise. Every promise of this new and abundant life that we receive through Christ, it originates right here in the Torah. And here's the thing. Who does it? God. God does it all. Moses took the message that God gave him. He spoke it to the people. And what'd they do? They wouldn't receive it. The reason they wouldn't receive the message of their deliverance, of their salvation, is contained in verse 9. And depending on your version, it is generally that the Israelite spirits were crushed. They were physically exhausted from their hard labors. You know, it's near to impossible to hear God when we are living constantly out of breath due to hyperactivity. Never slowing down. And when we're consumed and defeated by our never-ending, demanding fleshly necessities or the bitterness of our souls. The Hebrews were in servitude to Egypt because they were forced to be. We are in servitude because we were born into that condition. Just as God wanted to rescue Israel, he wants to rescue us. He wants to rescue you. But the Hebrews couldn't then, and only a very few of mankind can now, hear, accept that message of free redemption. So you say you want to be a prophet of God. Well, here's Moses. The Pharaoh laughs at him. And Moses' Hebrew brothers want to skin him. And God tells him, it's time to go see Pharaoh again. Oh, man. I mean, what appeared to be a settled matter with Moses not long ago once again is in doubt. As Moses says to God, now look, if the people of Israel won't listen to me, why is Pharaoh going to listen to me? Actually, what verse 11 literally quotes Moses saying is, I am of foreskinned, in other words, uncircumcised, lips. Now, this is an idiom. It means that his speech is poor. Poor in the sense of it's inadequate. What Moses is saying is, God, my ability to speak the words you want spoken is terrible. God would have none of it. In verse 12, God speaks to Moses and Aaron, and he makes it clear to them it's their duty before God to speak to Pharaoh and to the people of Israel, and the end result being the deliverance of the Hebrews from Egypt. You see, Moses thinks, and boy, catch this, Moses thinks it's his words. Moses thinks it's how he phrases those words, how he pronounces those words, whether or not he appears confident and prepared as he speaks those words to the people. That's the key for them getting this message of deliverance. God tried early on to convince him that Moses' own abilities didn't matter a whit. Out of mercy for a man who could not yet understand or fully accept God's ways, God gave Moses Aaron to speak for him, even though it really wasn't needed. Moses' inadequacies were never the issue. I'll tell you a story. Several years ago, when Becky and I lived in the Florida Keys. I went out on a church visitation with the assistant pastor of the church we attended. Now, we visited a young couple that had come to church kind of off and on for a few years, and now asked that a pastor would come and visit them. Now, this assistant pastor, well, he was one of the most wonderful, decent, real believers I think I've ever known. What a wonderful man. But when we went to these people's home and sat down, and he began to speak to this couple about their need for Christ and explain the gospel message, I listened in absolute horror. As he fouled this thing up so badly, I couldn't make heads or tails out of what he was saying. And I already knew the points we were there to make. I mean, this went on for a solid hour. It was torture. It was one of the longest, most uncomfortable hours of my life. And I sit there silently as that young couple did. I was embarrassed. I was wondering if these people would ever come to church again. And after he finished, because this is how you do it, the assistant pastor looks at him and says, "Okay, would you like to pray to receive Jesus now?" And I'm thinking, yeah, right, please let's just get up and get out of here. They both leaned forward and said, "Yes." What? And we prayed with them. I watched their lives change and grow over the next several months as the Holy Spirit became their guide. See, here's the thing. I went home that night and I told Becky the story. I told her I'd learned a great lesson that night. It's not our words. It's not our abilities that brings anyone to accept deliverance. It's God changing hearts. Yeah, we are indeed communicated to go and speak the message of salvation to the unsaved. But when we do that in God's will, and when He has prepared the hearts of those He has chosen for us to speak to, your words can't fail. Because our words are not the key. Never have been. Conversely, the most eloquent speech, the most perfectly prepared presentation can't bring anybody to the throne. It's 100% work of God. This great principle of Christian life is laid down right here in Exodus. Moses was completely inadequate for the job that God gave him. And Moses, of all people, knew it. You and I are completely inadequate for any of the tasks, including spreading the gospel, that God has given to us. But it doesn't matter. See, because our job is to trust and obey God. He says, go, we go. He'll do all the rest. See, Moses didn't understand that. He didn't believe it yet. Well, beginning in verse 14, we get a genealogy of the first three sons of Israel, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi. But all the attention is really paid to the Levites. Now, up here is a structure of Israel chart. We have talked before about the various names for the different levels of societal structure of Israel. And in these verses, these names and titles are used. Now, I know the various Bible versions use different English words, different English names. So if your version doesn't use the same names and titles I'm about to give you, I encourage you to write what I'm giving you in the margins of your Bibles for future reference. Look at Exodus 6:14. It says, these are the heads of the fathers' houses. Where it says heads, the Hebrew word is rosh. Rosh. It means head. And if we look a little further in the same verse, it says, these are the families. The Hebrew word used here is mishpacha, and should not be translated family. It should be translated clan. And because mishpacha is clan, the title assigned to the head, the rosh, of each of these clans is chief. So this verse is talking about the chiefs, who are the heads of the clans. This is the next tier of Israelite societal structure after the prince, who is the head, the rosh of the tribe. In time, as the current prince dies, one of the chiefs over one of the clans, usually the firstborn, he will become the new prince. The main point of the verses in chapter 6, beginning at 14, going on to the end of the chapter, is to establish the all-important fact that Moses and Aaron are of the Levite tribe. Further, they were of a very specific clan, the clan of Kohat. Two other clans of the Levites are also named, Gershon and Merari. We're not going to examine these clan lines for now. What's important to understand is that while the overall tribe of Levi was the tribe of priests, only one clan among the Levites could produce the line of high priests. The first high priest will be Aaron. And that is the line, the clan of Kohat, which will further subdivide into the line of Aaron. Now, the other Levite clans would be restricted to certain specific duties of lesser priests for some, of temple officials for others. And while the Bible hasn't informed us yet of which clans are going to get which duties, the genealogical record is being established right here, so that there can be no doubt later as to who belongs to which clan and who heads it all up. Next week, we'll begin chapter 7.